Hi, welcome back to the podcast of Wednesday's Child. Here on this channel, we like to have conversations with you all about eating disorder recovery. So that's whether you are coming at it from a direct perspective of being someone that's on an eating disorder recovery journey, or you're a carer, someone that's trying to support someone and navigate through that often very tricky pathway. So you're going to really enjoy this conversation today, as it will be pertinent to whether you are individually trying to recover or supporting someone. And as ever, I am joined by another wonderful guest on the podcast. And today it's Sarah Parker, our superb therapist. Hi, Sarah.
Hello, Debbie. It's lovely to be here with you.
Yeah, I am super excited about chatting about this because it comes up so many times, either from people that I know that have recovered and maybe they've relapsed, or people that are thinking about what's their route to recovery. And it's the classic phrase of all in for eating disorder recovery. So this is, I mean, we're going to dig into this, Sarah, but all in means different things to different people in terms of eating disorder recovery, doesn't it? But I think what I want to use this episode to do is to say, is it generally a good option for someone that's been perhaps suffering from an eating disorder for a long period of time, and they're saying, I just want this over, I want my life back, and perhaps they've heard about all in and it just feels like, do you know what, maybe that's quicker, maybe that's an easier solution. So before we delve into what that looks like, let me just ask you, do you get people coming to you and saying, I've considered or I am doing all in? And if you care to share, do you want to talk about whether you ever contemplated it for your own eating disorder recovery?
Yeah, I mean, I do. Mostly people are much more hesitant and want to be a bit slower and a bit at a time. But certainly there are people that come in and want to do all in. And I think I've seen all aspects of that, Debbie. I've seen people that have gone through it and it's been a bit of a white knuckle ride, and they've done it. And I've seen people that have started and it's overwhelming.
Yeah.
And so I think it's both. And I think when we think about, particularly with anorexia nervosa, the nature of our plate shows often the nature of how we live life. And the plate says, give me less. And so if we go in all in, we're going entirely the opposite of what we've been saying we need with the plate. Now, that's not wrong, and it's not, it's not necessarily going to be a kind of a recipe for disaster, but we've got to consider, is going from one extreme to the other really going to be the best? And I think we see people a lot with eating disorders that have very black and white thinking, and there's almost a real sense of that black and white thinking with the all-in approach. I also think, and this was definitely the case for me, Debbie, that when we are starved and we're thinking about food all the time and we're food obsessed because we're starved, it looks like an amazing thing to be able to just eat what we want when we want and do recovery that way. But what I often see is that doesn't last, because then the fear kicks in when we start it and it becomes really distressing. So I guess I had several attempts of all in, all of which took me to a recovered body weight, but not a recovered mind. The final one did, but and I think sometimes, all in, the body works quicker than the mind. So even with all in, we can recover our body weight, but our mind will take the time it's going to take.
Then there's the risk then that if the body weight has gone so rapidly far ahead of the cognitive restoration,
Yeah.
then there's this all of a sudden this absolute meltdown, freak out, whatever you like, and then you're in body distress,
Yes.
as well as not being kind of, mentally able to process what you've just put yourself through.
Yeah.
So
And I think, sorry, Debbie.
potentially you go back to zero and kind of hit yourself into reverse.
Yeah, and that, I think that's the risk. I think equally, if we're going to consider all in, we've got to consider, how do we help ourselves through that bridge where our body weight has gone to there, but our minds are still playing catch up, because that disconnect between the mind getting to where it needs to be in the body is the hardest part of it. And so the key, I think, to all in is being prepared for the difference in where our cognitions are and where our body weight is, and how do we support ourselves to sustain that until our mind has caught up.
And just for the purpose of people that perhaps are kind of listening to this channel, and maybe they're a kind of parent or carer and relatively new to the world of eating disorders and recovery strategies, some people may not know the sort of definition, if indeed there is one, of an all-in recovery. I guess that's where this becomes a little bit grey, doesn't it? Because what means all-in to you might mean different to me. I mean, I know some people that have said to me, no, all in for me means like everything's like, nothing's off limits. I'm going to eat anything and everything. If it's McDonald's 5 times a day, other fast food outlets are available, or if it's just really committing to that kind of 3 meals, 3 snacks. So, and it could be dropping exercise and kind of movement at the same time, so it could combine with that. But other people see it quite differently, and I suspect we might also say that also depends what is your eating disorder that you're bringing to the entry point, because are you someone that is only in a restrictive diet, or are you also binging, purging, and is your body at its set point or beyond it at the point you seek to begin all in? So all of these are factors, aren't they?
Really important factors. And really interestingly, Debbie, what I hear most often for people that aren't at a particularly low body weight, they really struggle with the all-in approach because there's a fear that their weight will go over. And, so weight issues, I mean, clearly weight issues are part of eating disorders, but they seem to figure much more in sense of how do we do recovery and the fear that comes in with the all-in approach. And I think you're right. I think just as recovery treatment has to be person-centered, has to be about that individual. I think the all-in approach is also about how that individual sees it, needs it, wants it to look. So I think there is no easy definition of it. It's what it means to the individual.
Yeah. So what do you think, looking back for yourself, then, were the key things that kind of did or didn't make it more or less comfortable to consider all in when you started looking at it? And presumably you'd explored it because your recovery started in a different way, but maybe you felt, I just need this done quicker, or...
I think for me, I knew that dabbling about was going to take me back. It was going to almost give me permission to go back to restricting again. And that was a real pattern. So if I was kind of half in, half out, I was giving myself still the option of, well, I could restrict today or I could do, and I knew that very quickly that restriction would grow and it would dominate again. So
because history told you that was the pattern that Sarah had previously followed.
Yeah. For many years, there was a real sense of, as soon as I got that feeling of restriction, I knew that would carry me somewhere where it wasn't towards recovery. And so for me, taking away that option was probably the best choice for me. It was painful and it was difficult. And the hardest part of it was sustaining that period where my mind had to catch up and I had to get used to a new body, because it wasn't a gradual, it was, my weight restoration was probably over the course of 4 or 5 months. And that sounds to somebody without an eating disorder perhaps a long time, but actually when your body's being starved and emaciated and then you go to a healthy body again, that's a big change and a big difference in how it feels.
I mean, that's really quick, and actually, depending where you're at your life stage, that's introducing all sorts of hormonal changes and functions. So, we often know that one of the trigger points for people that go into recovery is when the menstrual cycle returns or something, because for a lot of people, they commence that eating disorder journey, whether through trauma or other reasons, that actually that suppressing of adulthood is significant, isn't it? So then once the body weight restores to such an extent that then you're getting a physical representation of the fact that, it's functioning, that must mean I've done enough.
Yes.
But have you?
Yes.
Have you? Because has your brain caught up just because you happen to have got a one-off period?
Absolutely. But I also think it doesn't necessarily mean that you've done enough physically either, because, menstruation will stop and start for people at very different. Some people never lose their periods. Some people lose them very quickly and it takes a long time to get them back. So whilst often we hear people saying, well, I must be all right because I'm menstruating again. That isn't necessarily the case, because it depends on the individual, Debbie. But I also think we've got to think about people who are neurodivergent and the changes in that sensation of their body, the sensation of clothes on their body as their body's changing. That can be really difficult. And actually, for those people, perhaps a slower approach might be beneficial. And I'm not prescribing that, but I think it's about considering neurodivergence and the impact of sensory issues, so that that rapid change might just become really overwhelming and unsustainable.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see why somebody might think to do it at pace feels like it will hurt less and
Yeah.
it gets it done. But you really, as with all things, we've said this so many times about, what form of therapy do you choose? When do you embrace recovery? It really is so individual. It has to be a unique pathway. And I suppose within the eating disorder community, I know people sort of take comfort or advice or, just insight from others, but it really, you've got to consider, where are you at? How long
Yes.
have you had your eating disorder?
Yeah.
What are your patterns of behavior? And the other thing I would say is, who's your tribe and where is that tribe? Have you got people around you? Husband, family, parents, who's going to be there when you are screaming at the walls,
Yeah.
angry as hell, but
Yeah.
still want to keep going.
Yeah. And who's going to remain there when you're in that state? That's what's really
Yeah.
important. Who's going to stay there with you? Because I think that it is difficult and there will be a lot of emotion that comes through. And I think it's about, how do we prepare for that as best we can? And when it's there, how do we hold ourselves with compassion through it? And how do we find the people that will also be able to remain compassionate in the face of big feelings that we've got?
Yeah, but it brings to mind, I know that somebody that we were dealing with within the Wednesday's Child community at the time of COVID, and for her own personal reasons, so she was someone in her sort of, I suppose, early 30s at the time, and was living on her own during COVID, and she got very excited about the opportunity to embrace all in during COVID lockdown. Her rationale being, the one thing that she had found really difficult whenever she tried to recover previously is, as soon as she nudged a little bit of weight on, she saw someone, they'd mention it, she'd feel awkward about it, so she'd restrict again. So what she decided to do is, I know we're in for this kind of period of being behind closed doors. I'd rather get the whole lot out the way, deal with it, enjoy getting back into a routine of cooking when there's little else to do, and then just face that when I come out the other side of it and people see my changed body, well, it's done. And I kind of I really
Yeah.
got what her motivation was for that. I thought it
Yeah.
was interesting. It was a kind of, this is a really surreal space to be in,
Yeah.
and I'm going to do it this way. I think the only thing that came up for me, and I remember having the conversations with her about, were, if you are going to go so full on into all in after such a prolonged period, and she had had severe and enduring eating disorder for a long time, I think there is an argument for needing to let your kind of general practitioner or someone that you've worked with kind of in confidence along your journey know what you're intending to do.
Absolutely. I also think as well, for somebody that's been restricting for a long time, it's vital that we have bloods done, because there is always a risk of refeeding syndrome. If we go all in, we have to start a little bit gradually, because that will help to reduce the risk of refeeding syndrome. So having contact with your GP so that you are having, at least in the beginning, regular bloods done, just to
Yeah.
check your physical well-being and that your body is able to, you know, manage this and do what you need it to do. I think it's a really good point, Debbie, and it's really interesting, that we can't just go from severe restriction to all in. We've got to, at least for the first couple of weeks, increase a bit more gradually, because we will be at risk of refeeding syndrome, and that's a very real risk.
Yeah. So you move on the kind of process of somebody committing to all in. How do you, as a therapist, help somebody who's, maybe initially is a bit of a honeymoon? I'm eating chocolate, I'm eating ice cream, I'm doing this, I'm not feeling restricted. And then, as you say, the body shape starts to change. There's a bit of that kind of cognition saying, oh, okay, I'm not what I was, and maybe I'm starting to miss my previous body. I'm starting to reevaluate my identity. What are the fundamental things you focus on either during that process or once some of that all-in process has been achieved? How do you keep that person from, I guess, kind of reaching backwards and wanting to revert?
Yeah, I think there are lots of things that we can do. One of which is to focus on identity, because so often in treatment there's a focus on the eating disorder. What weight you're restoring, or are you reducing the amount of times you're binging and purging, or whatever it might be. And so we lose sight of the person. The person's already lost sight of themselves to the eating disorder. So it really is, sometimes therapy really can look like a chat. We talk about what music they love, what brings them alive, what friends they have, how do they choose their friends, what are their hopes and dreams, because it's about getting to know that person again. But also it's about looking at that value system, what really matters, what matters to the person as opposed to what matters to the eating disorder. Because our minds will kick in always. When we make changes, the fear comes and our minds say, this is not what we do to feel okay. What we do is what we've always done to feel okay, and that's restrict or binge and purge, whatever. So we've got to go to a different place for support, because our minds are not going to want us to go in a direction that brings us distress.
I mean, how do we, what's the kind of language that we should be using with someone that we are trying to support? Like, there's one thing you coming at it from a therapist perspective and trying to hold someone to account. But imagine the parent, the husband, the wife, that's living with that and saying, actually, I'm really pleased, proud, probably a bit relieved that this person is going to do all in, because ultimately it's going to make our life better, quicker, and see their return to health. But how do we deal with the tantrums? How do we? Because ultimately they happen, don't they?
Yeah, and I think we're all human, and sometimes carers, parents, loved ones won't deal with it very well. And that's the reality, and there will be conflict sometimes. And I think it's about knowing that that conflict isn't because anybody's failing at anything. It's just that the process is really difficult for everybody. And I think, commenting on size is never going to be helpful, ever. Commenting on the visible changes to the body is never going to be helpful. But I think what can be really helpful is, because even if somebody says, oh, you look well, most people with an eating disorder will they think I look fatter.
Yeah.
So that's not helpful. But your eyes look bright, or you seem to have a bit more energy, or you're smiling a bit more. Now, even that in the beginning might be too much. Any comments on that person's sense of presence might be too much. So it might be that you just don't go there. You just ask gently, how are you? How are things? Is there anything I can help with? Is there anything I can do or say that might be helpful? So ask the person rather than assume. And I think that most comments are well intentioned, but many comments can be really difficult and will be perceived as something entirely different from the person that's doing the recovery process.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think even when we think we're determined to embrace full recovery, there's still a little bit of our brain wanting to be more invisible. So when you're highlighting us, our shape, our size, or even what we're wearing, it feels, oh no, you've put me the center of this conversation. I'm not comfortable with that. Please don't make it about me.
And I think that's, it's so important that the person who is going through the recovery process finds some phrases, some words for themselves that can say, please don't say that, please don't do that, or I don't find that helpful. And one of the things for me was that fear that if I looked better, people thought I was better. And actually, for most of us going through recovery, we feel a lot worse than we do when we're in the middle of an eating disorder. So for then to lose that care and support from people because they assume that we're doing better is really terrifying. So I think it's about finding those words that can say in our own words, I'm still really struggling. I still need a lot of support. Or I'm still really struggling. Please don't assume I've got this now. I still need support. So it's finding our voice as well that can say, because for so long our bodies do the talking. Look at me, I'm struggling. And we need to find the words then, because people won't necessarily know that we're struggling anymore.
No, and it's just a lack of education and understanding, isn't it, on behalf of, it might be the parent, it might be the carer, but from their perspective, they're just darn relieved to see you perhaps not looking quite as unwell as you once did. And hence thinking, oh goodness, I can remember phrases like, thank goodness that nonsense is all over. And actually, the nonsense was more angry and more, just aggressive in my head than it had ever been. But my body had begun to change. So the fear had gone out of other people's lives to such an extent. And actually, I think that is a real tipping point. I don't know what you think when you see people in therapy, but I think there's a danger then, particularly in that parent-child relationship, where if that child's cognition hasn't caught up, there's the danger that they think, oh, I'm not going to get the support, the kindness, the compassion now. And if it's all too easy to slip and to think, actually, I was better over here in this position because they cared about me, they worried about me, and that was the identity that I can relate to. I don't want to be ignored as healthy when I'm still battling in my mind.
And, we know that a lot of people with eating disorders, I'd say most people have poor self-esteem. And so to be able to say, please help me is really difficult. To be able to say, I need something is really difficult. And for me, one of the most important things on my last kind of episode that took me to full recovery was I had to allow myself to recover without the pressure of thinking, because I hadn't worked for 15 years, Debbie. I'd been in and out of hospital and hadn't worked, hadn't been part of society really, had hidden away and hadn't been part of anything. And so the idea of recovery, not only was it terrifying that my body was going to change, it was terrifying that my mind thought, I've got to work. I'm not going to have any support anymore. I've got to be out in this big world that I don't know anything about. And so I had to say to myself, and I had to get that support from others that, okay, this is what I'm doing. I can't guarantee that I'm going to go back to work or that I'm going to do anything more than I already doing. The only thing this means is I'm going to get a healthier body. And the rest of it, I had to set aside because it was too much pressure for me. And that came actually as my body and my mind got healthier. I was ready to do that. But if I'd thought at the beginning I had to do all of that, I wouldn't have started.
Goodness. It's almost like saying, there's this whole box of jigsaw pieces here and it all looks really overwhelming. But actually, if I start to put the edges together first and just look at it a piece at a time,
I can't promise I can fill the middle, but maybe I'll be able to if I've got the edges and the corners.
Yeah. Wow. Do you remember things that were happening in terms of how your family and your friends related to you around that time and how helpful or not that was for you?
I think for me, the year before my final admission, my dad had died. And so there was a lot of focus on the grief for him, and my mum's grief for him. And my mum, I was really aware that my mum was potentially facing grief for me too. Now, I didn't go into hospital on my last admission, Debbie, believing that was going to be it, that I was going to recover. I went in because she wanted me to, and something grew out of that seed. But I also know that I really had that support from my mum, that she didn't care if I ever worked again. She didn't care what I did with my life. She cared that I was healthy. And that for me was so important because it gave me permission to restore my health without the pressure of restoring my life straight away.
Gosh, that's so, I find that so powerful hearing you say that, because I can't tell you how many parents, and this is not talking ill of anybody, but in the last sort of few months, particularly as we were coming towards the end of the sort of academic term, and over this summer holiday period, and the thing that comes up constantly with parents is, I want her to be well and do well in the exams, or I want her to be able to go off to university, and I want her to realise that she's messing up her opportunity to do well in a career. And actually, perhaps there's a danger that you can project that big stuff onto someone when, yes, it is important to you as a parent, and it should be important to them too, but we've really got to remember that their focus just needs to be on getting their body and mind well, and knowing that you are there to love them in that pursuit, and that pursuit only for now.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think it is so important because, if we are doing 10 things at once, if we're starting to think about studying again or working again and training again and whatever else, as well as recovery, it's going to be overwhelming. And I think that permission to simply focus on health is really central for a lot of people, because it can be way too much. And I think the rest will come as the mind and the body restores.
Yeah.
But asking for it to all come at the beginning means that we take two big steps and then we fall often.
Yeah. So we're going to give some top tips then for someone that said, do you know what, I've looked into All In, I am convinced this is something I really want to do. What would be your things that you would be saying that, kind of the toolkit that people have got to have in place, the steps, even before they say, oh yeah, this is the route I'm going. Anything that kind of, comes top of mind for you?
I think, as you alluded to, Debbie, support. What's
Yeah.
your support system? Who are your support network? Let them know. Let them know that this might be tricky. Bring them in, tell them what you're doing, keep them included and involved, because we don't do any of this alone. I think it's really difficult to do it alone. Go to your GP, even if it's your practice nurse that you might see regularly. I think having that physical health monitoring, at least through the early stages, is really important. And I think almost give yourself permission that if you get partway into this and it feels too much, doesn't mean you have to go back, but you can pause a moment and reflect and think about where you're at, what you need now. So each step of the way, where am I? How am I? What do I need? What matters to me? Why am I doing this? Do I still want to do this? Do I maybe need to do something a little bit different? It's not saying stop doing it. It's saying regulate the speed.
Yeah.
And just
No, that's a
be
really good way of putting it.
reflective.
Regulate the speed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know that even in that, sometimes we will go into reverse gear a little bit, but at some point we know that we can put it back into drive again.
Yeah. I think the other thing for me, I would say that it's where journaling becomes useful, and whether that's journaling in a written book, or as somebody told me they're doing the other day, just a little voice note to yourself on a daily basis, just to remind yourself how your emotions were feeling and how you were adjusting as you progress through that route. Because I think it's all too easy to forget and not really check in with yourself and say, actually, do you know what? My humour's coming back, or I had the energy to do that. I said yes to that thing spontaneously, because you got to clock the wins as you
Yes.
go through this journey, as well as just thinking, oh, okay, that bit was really hard today. It's really important to just make a note. And I think if you're on that recovery pathway, but you can look back and say, actually, 7 days ago, I would never have had that joke, or, gone out and done that thing. But already I am seeing some benefit come into play here. And if that helps the
Absolutely.
motivation to stay the
Yes.
course.
Totally, totally. And with the weather a bit cooler now, often I hear with people, it's so much better not to feel that deep sense of cold in
More
the
cold in your
cold weather.
bones.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that often comes up in the process of change. That sense of the coldness isn't nearly as penetrating as it was.
Yeah,
And that's a big
absolutely.
win.
Yeah. Gosh, there's plenty of them, isn't there, when you start to
There
get
are.
one.
And, in that journal, maybe write down the big wins, not just the difficult emotions, the big wins. Even if you don't journal, but you have a list of wins, little wins, big wins, whatever they are, they're all wins. So keep that little list going so you see it growing and you see why you're doing this.
Yeah. And I'll tell you what would be great for me, and I'm sure you would agree with this, is that if anybody's listening to this and wants to share your wins of as you've gone through that recovery journey or how you journaled them or acknowledged them, that would be terrific, whether you choose to kind of treat yourself or you do something every time you've acknowledged a particular win, that would be great. So
Amazing.
So this episode has not been about trying to convince or prescribe all in for everybody or even anybody. It's just saying it is a method, if you like, of recovery that quite a lot of people do seek to embrace. And as we've said here today, there are advantages of it for sure. But as with all treatment approaches, let's just really implore you to consider what's your unique scenario, your situation, your tribe around you, your ability to support yourself as you go through it. Be open-minded and open-eyed in terms of recognizing what you might go through along that recovery pathway. Oh, well, I'm hoping a few of you are going to listen and say, I did it, it worked for me, or God, no, I had to choose something else. But the more we get those kind of stories that we can share with people, all the better. Well, thank you, Sarah. As ever, it's always lovely being joined by you and getting your expertise and also a real lot of personal insight today. And I know sometimes it can be tricky when you bring back into play your own personal experiences, but I think I'll say it personally from my point of view. I think that's what makes you an even more special and compassionate eating disorders therapist, because you really are bringing that lived experience and you are able to meet people where they're at.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think to have felt that fear, to have felt that sense of deep dread that we go through, I think you can't underestimate that. And so for everybody, be gentle. This is not an easy process, but it is an entirely possible one,
Yeah,
however you do it.
recovery is indeed possible. Well, thanks everyone for listening to the latest episode of the Wednesday's Child podcast. We'll be back again very, very soon. But from Sarah Parker and from myself, that's it for now. You take care and just keep on focusing on your own unique recovery.